Hey guys, tonight we journey back, way back to a wedding that by all accounts should have been just another stuffy gathering of overly dramatic immortals. Wine-flowing lyres, plucking nymphs, twirling in decorative spirals. Instead, it becomes the birthplace of an argument that snowballs into one of the longest and pettiest conflicts in mythology. Standing at the edge of Mount Pelion, watching gods descend from the skies like they're arriving at the Met Gala. They shimmer, they sparkle, they're wearing togas you definitely couldn't afford, even if you sold 3 goats and your best amphitha. Occasion the wedding of Peleus, a respected Greek hero, and Thetis, a beautiful sea nymph with some serious boundary issues when it comes to raising children. You wouldn't expect this humble union to spiral into war, but well, you probably won't survive this party. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I put the history in your headphones so you can drift off now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're not technically invited, but you slip in anyway, trailing behind a very distracted dryad, who seems to think you're the caterer. The wedding is held in a secluded glade, surrounded by singing rivers and enchanted pine trees, all of which hum faintly like they're tuned to a sleepy lullaby. Even the air smells expensive, like ambrosia mixed with fresh fig. Bread gods and goddesses lounge on impossibly ornate couches, chatting in that vaguely arrogant way only deities can pull off. You notice Dionysus trying to spike the punch, while Athena quietly corrects his grammar. Aphrodite flirts with a pair of naiads who looked like they just walked out of a perfume ad. You find a soft patch of moss and settle in halfway through the first course, which appears to be delicately roasted peacock feathers with a side of golden olives. Do not ask how the olives are golden, you're just here to enjoy the vibe, and for a moment it really does seem peaceful. The bride Thetis is radiant in seafoam. She has that calm, glowing look of someone who knows her child is destined to be a world-ending hero or a nightmare, depending on who you ask. Peleus sits beside her, proud, slightly sweaty, and clearly just trying to make it through the speech's butt. Then it happens, a rustle from the shadows, a faint whiff of chaos, that unmistakable scent of drama enters the arena. Eris, goddess of discord. She was not invited now. In mortal weddings, the uninvited usually sulk at home or post cryptic shade on social media. But Eris takes a more interactive approach. She materializes in a storm cloud of passive, looking like the kind of guest who shows up in all black just to make a point in her hand. She holds a golden apple, not a snack, an object of divine mischief. Etched into its surface in glittering ancient script are 3 innocentish words to the fairest. She lobs it right into the middle of the buffet table, knocking over a chalice of nectar and at least 3 candied fig salons. Slowly, painfully, predictably, 3 goddesses rise. Hera, queen of the gods, who has the poise of a royal and the energy of someone who's definitely emailed your manager before. Athena, goddess of wisdom, who already looks like she's preparing a thesis defense. And Aphrodite, the literal embodiment of beauty, love, and probably lipstick eats. One glances at the apple, then at each other, then back at the apple. You can almost hear the internal monologues, the smug confidence, the subtle narrowing of eyes, the way each of them already assumes the apple was meant for her. You, however, are busy quietly pocketing an abandoned honey cake, because frankly this situation is above your pay grade. The argument begins softly, a few raised brows, a few casual remarks disguised as compliments. Hera notes how difficult it is to look youthful when ruling the cosmos. Athena mentions the importance of intelligence over appearance. Aphrodite just smiles, like someone who knows she's going to win, regardless. And Somewhere in the back, Eris melts into the trees, smirking to herself. Her job here is done. Historians still argue whether Eris truly meant to start a divine conflict, or whether she was just incredibly bad at handling rejection. But regardless of her motive, the golden apple has landed, and the fallout is immediate. The wedding fizzles. You slip away, unnoticed, past a couple of satyrs who are still arguing over who gets to keep the leftover ambrosia. The mood has shifted. The air now feels heavier, like the calm before a particularly judgmental thunderstorm. Back on Mount Olympus, the gossip spreads faster than Hermes. With new sandals, you hear whispers in marble halls, debates in moonlit gardens, gods taking sides in private salons over wine that tastes like sunlight, and that apple still gleams untaken, sitting on a table in a temple, waiting for someone to decide who deserves it. Boiler alert, it will not be resolved diplomatically. Instead, the three goddesses agree to find a mortal, someone neutral, someone uninvolved, someone arguably very bad at saying no. You do not yet know his name, but his sheep are about to become very famous, and thus the seeds are planted, not for a war, not yet, but for something worse. Beauty contest, judged by a man who's mostly just trying to avoid doing chores. You wake up the next morning on a grassy hill just outside the city of Troy. The sunrise creeping over distant mountains like a shy chorus girl. And there he is, Prince Paris, lounging beneath an olive tree haze. Not what you expected from someone at the center of a myth haze, not sharpening a sword or riding a chariot or even wearing shoes. Haze just there, half asleep, scratching the ears of a goat with one hand and tossing pebbles into a stream with the other. Paris technically is royalty, but Hayes been raised far from court life, ever since a very awkward prophecy at birth declared him a future firestarter of kingdoms. So he was sent away, like a cursed casserole, to be raised by shepherds instead of statesmen. He likes it out here, the sheep. The quiet, the lack of divine meddling. Too bad that last bit is about to change above him. Clouds part, ever so slightly. You glance up and see three goddesses descending like celestial influencers on a sponsored trip to Earth. Each lands with dramatically unnecessary grace, as if auditioning for a perfume. And Paris blinks once, twice, then tries to pretend Hayes asleep. It does not work. Hera speaks first, her voice smooth with the confidence of a goddess who invented marriage insurance. She informs Paris that Hayes been chosen to judge a contested beauty contest between herself, Athena, and Aphrodite. No pressure. You watch him struggle to form words. He glances at you as if to say, please help, I am absolutely unqualified for this. You do not help, you are eating grapes you found in a bush, and this is the most interesting thing to happen all week. Athena steps forward and promises him wisdom, endless strategic brilliance, power of perception, the kind of intellect that could make him the Jeff Bezos of ancient warfare. Hera offers power, literal kingship, dominion over vast lands, wealth enough to fund decades of extremely bad decisions. Aphrodite smiles and simply offers love, the love of the most beautiful mortal woman alive. Paris blinks again. Chooses Aphrodite. Now there's an open scholarly debate over whether Paris chose out of lust, stupidity, or sheer panic. The sources vary. Some say he was enchanted, some say he was just very, very single. But regardless, the golden apple is handed to Aphrodite. The other two goddesses are not amused. Athena mutters something about narrow definitions of beauty, while Hera makes a mental note to absolutely ruin this man's family tree. Lead to the goddesses vanish, leaving Paris standing alone, the apple nowhere to be seen, and an odd sense that Hayes just done something incredibly irreversible. Meanwhile, back in Olympus, the gossip mill kicks into high gear. Ambrosia sails skyrocket Olympus. Twitter probably explodes with vague posts like not everyone who wears a crown deserves the apple land. Somewhere far off in the marble halls of Sparta, Helen, queen of Menelaus, goes about her morning routine, blissfully unaware that she is now a promised prize in a deal she did not make you. Trail Paris back to Troy Hayes, still dazed, still barefoot, muttering to himself about the unbearable pressure of beauty standards. His goats nudge him, supportive Elibet. That night, as the stars bloom across the sky, Aphrodite appears again and whispers her promise. You will have her. She says her meaning. Helen Paris nods, without really understanding what that entails back in Sparta. Helen is not just beautiful, she's mythically beautiful. The kind of beautiful that inspires poets, painters, entire military campaigns, depending on who you ask. She's also clever, ambitious, and maybe a little bit bored. Her husband, Menelaus, king of Sparta, is often away at war, or hunting, or trying to figure out ancient taxes. Hayes, strong, decisive, prone to sword polishing as stress relief when Paris finally visits Sparta under the charming pretense of diplomacy. The stage is quietly set for mythic disaster. You follow him into the palace, a marvel of sunlit courtyards, mosaic floors, and far too many marble statues of people looking vaguely heroic. Paris is treated like a guest of honor, fine wine, golden goblets, roasted lamb. You know the drill. Helen appears, and the world sort of hiccups. Paris stares. Helen smiles politely, the way someone might smile at a dog wearing a cape. What exactly happened next is one of the great mysteries of ancient storytelling. Some versions say Helen fell in love with Paris, instantly drawn to his tragic backstory and poorly tied sandals. Others claim she was enchanted, tricked, spirited away without consent. Still argue whether Helen went willingly or was kidnapped, whether it was fate or foolishness or both. But what we know is this: Eris leaves Sparta and Helen goes with him. The diplomatic meltdown. Menelaus returns home from whatever manly thing he was doing to discover that his wife, his pride, his political asset has vanished across the Aegean Sea, with a foreign prince who's barely old enough to vote. You do not want to be in that room when he finds out messengers are dispatched, ships readied, alliances invoked. Remember that time back in their youth when all the Greek kings and suitors swore an oath to defend Helen's marriage. No one expected it to actually be enforced, but here we trail Menelaus to a dusty Amphictyonic council meeting where kings from all over Greece gather under an ancient oath to do something about this. Agamemnon shows up, dripping with ego and battle plans. Odysseus slinks in, muttering about how Hayes got a newborn at home and zero interest in sailing. To Troy, Nestor speaks in proverbs no one understands, but everyone nods respectfully anyway, and suddenly this stolen romance has turned into a full-blown coalition war effort. You can't help but marvel at the absurdity. One golden apple, one beauty contest, one impulsive prince, and now an entire continent is going to wall because nobody wanted to hurt a goddess's feelings. You're at the shoreline now, sandals sinking slightly into wet sand as ship after ship is hauled into the sea like a fleet of angry wooden ducks. These aren't small fishing vessels, these are massive, creaky, purpose-built warboats adorned with carved eyes and fitted with enough oars to power a minor festival. The wind smells of salt, tar, and optimism, the dangerous kind. You wander among the warriors, gathering in droves. Some look like heroes out of legend, golden armor, gleaming like they've been waiting their whole lives for a suitably poetic battle. Others are just farmers with spears, clearly regretting some life choices. This is the great Greek expedition forming right before your eyes, and yes, you do step aside quickly when someone Yells about a sacred goose going missing, again at the center of the chaos stands. Agamemnon, Menelaus, older brother, king of Mycenae, and the sort of person who always wants to be in charge, even when ordering lunchy. Already barking orders. Polishing his sword with exaggerated flair and arguing with a priest over wind conditions. You notice Odysseus, sulking nearby, still doing everything he can to not be here. He'd faked madness at one point, plowing his fields in zigzags with salt. Instead of seed, but someone threw his baby in front of the plow, and he swerved, thus proving his sanity and ruining his exit strategy. Now he's here muttering about prophecies and how his wife is going to be furious, one of the more interesting. A rival's is Achilles, young, fast, nearly invincible, depending on which scroll you read, and possibly wearing armor blessed by the gods himself. He is followed by his loyal companion, Patroclus, who carries extra sandals and looks like someone who knows all your secrets. Achilles doesn't speak much, but you hear mutterings. He's coming only because his mother Thetis said he'd gain eternal glory or die young, or possibly both. He seems less concerned than you'd expect now. Here's the fun part. Fleet can't launch. Why? Because there's no wind for days, maybe weeks. The ships just sit there like massive wooden question marks on the beach. The soldiers get bored, play dice, carve questionable jokes into the holes. Some even write Homergum paces up and down the shore, cursing the sky and threatening to sacrifice furniture. Then a priest arrives, Grimfest robe flapping dramatically in the breeze that somehow still doesn't reach the sails. He brings news from the gods, specifically Artemis, the huntress, who is very annoyed enough to still the wind. Why? Because Agamemnon offended her by maybe bragging he was the better archer, or maybe hunting sacred deer, or maybe just existing loudly. Again, historians still argue the only solution. Sacrifice your daughter. Agamemnon blinks. Everyone else blinks you. Swallow the grape you were chewing and start casually backing away the daughter in question. Iphigenia is summoned under the pretense of marrying Achilles, which is frankly one of the worst wedding surprises in mythology. Depending on the version you believe, she's either tricked, sacrificed, or spirited away by Artemis at the last second in a swirl of divine misty. The way, once the deed is done, the wind picks up and the ships finally sail. You ride with them across the wine-dark sea, as Homer would later write, which sounds lovely, but mostly means everyone is seasick. The ocean stretches out in all directions, and you begin to understand just how far the Greeks are willing to go for a bad breakup. Days pass, maybe weeks. The fleet finally arrives on the shores of Troy, the city's high walls gleaming like polished bronze under the morning sun. You can feel the tension as thousands of warriors pour onto the beach, wet, cranky, and looking for glory. The Trojans aren't asleep at the wheel. Priam, the king, is already fortifying the walls. Hector, his eldest son, is preparing the defense. Paris is polishing his hair. War doesn't explode at once. It stretches, yawns, grows like a very long, very expensive grudge. Years pass, literally years, and while the war occasionally flares with sword fights and skirmishes, much of it is just awkward camping with the occasional divine interference. One real historical debate among scholars is whether this war was metaphorical, political, or an epic poem's invention, possibly inspired by trade disputes or turf wars over strategic coastal cities. But you're here in the version where gods bicker mortals' posture, and sometimes cows explode for no reason. The Greeks build a base on the beach and start trying to starve Troy out, but the Trojans hold strong. Their city is clever, built to last, and their leaders surprisingly good at teamwork, especially considering one of them recently stole another man's wife. Achilles begins to build a reputation as a warrior who can't be stopped, which becomes a problem when he also refuses to listen to Odyssey. Too fast, too proud, too good, and far too aware of it's still the war. Goes on every night, fires flicker across the shoreline, music drifts from the ships, and distant horns echo from the Trojan towers. You find yourself drifting to sleep under the stars, wrapped in a borrowed cloak, listening to the murmurs of history. Unfolding, you dream of golden apples floating in wine, of distant gods watching this mess like a poorly written stage, planed of the feeling that none of this is going to end cleanly. You're back in the Greek camp now, where the mood has curdled like spoiled goat milk, and the sand is crunching under your sandals in a way that tells you things are about to go sideways. Is furious Sigonand when Achilles is mad? Everyone gets very quieted. All starts because Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, supreme commander of the Greek forces, has a particular talent for making terrible decisions at the worst possible times. And this time, he's managed to insult the one person who actually wins battles. There was a dispute over war prizes, specifically a woman named Brises, taken during a raid and awarded to Achilles as a prize of honor, the kind of thing people argued about in those days, instead of air miles. But Agamemnon throws a fit because his own prize, Chryses, was demanded back by Apollo's priest, and Agamemnon gave her up only very reluctantly after Apollo started firing plague arrows into the camp for several very uncomfortable days, so to reassert his dominance. He does the worst possible thing. He takes Brises from Achilles. Now, if you know anything about Achilles, besides the whole invincibility and Cleopatra situation, you know he does not handle disrespect well. He doesn't storm into battle, he storms out of it, retreats to his tent, sits there brooding like the god of moody sighs, and refuses to fight you. Walk past his tent, and it is silent, except for the occasional sound of Patroclus offering him grapes and increasingly anxious encouragement. Without Achilles, the Greeks start to struggle. The Trojans, sensing weakness, push harder, led by Hector, who is not just Troy's greatest warrior, but also weirdly likable, given the context. He fights like a whirlwind, but also hugs his wife, Andromache, and plays with his baby son before heading out to battle. You watch him polish his armor by torchlight, that soft glow reflecting off bronze as he whispers goodbyes. He hopes won't be final. Every day he leads charge after charge out of the gates. Night he returns, dusted in blood and sand, sometimes carrying wounded comrades on his back. Paris, meanwhile, is still trying to figure out how to load a bow correctly now. Here's where the gods decide to make things even more complicated. They are bored. They begin taking sides more openly. Hera and Athena root for the Greeks. Aphrodite and Apollo support the Trojans. Zeus pretends to stay neutral, but definitely has a favorite depending on which way the wind is blowing in. This turns the battlefield into a divine playground. Storms appear out of nowhere. Spears move slightly mid-air. Heroes survive things they absolutely should not survive. You pretty sure you saw a cow levitate once, but nobody believes. Youth Greeks become desperate, and that's when Patroclus makes his fateful decision. He puts on Achilles' armor. The goal is to scare the Trojans, make them think Achilles has returned to the field and maybe break their momentum. Achilles reluctantly agrees, tells them to come back after pushing them from the ships. Do not chase them to the walls, he says. Guess what Patroclus does? You follow him onto the battlefield, and for a while it works brilliantly. The Trojans fall back, confused and terrified. The Greeks rally. Patroclus charges forward, shining like a second sun, but he doesn't stop. He charges all the way to the gate sand. There he meets Hector. Duel is brief and brutal. Patroclus falls, and everything changes. You can hear the roar from Achilles' camp before the messenger even reaches him. When he learns what happened, when he realizes Hector killed Patroclus, while wearing his armor something inside him snaps you. Watch as he walks silently to the beach, stands ankle deep in the surf, and screams to the heavens, calling upon his mother. Thetis, he wants new armor and he wants revenge. He gets both. Thetis begs Hephaestus, the divine blacksmith, to craft something worthy of her son, and what he produces is more than armor. It's myth, it glows, it sings, it has constellations etched across the chest and rivers flowing across the greaves. Achilles puts it on and becomes less man, more storm-heat. Returns to battle like a force of nature, unhinged, unstoppable. Barely mortal any Mirand, Hector knows he stands atop the wall, knowing Achilles is coming for him, knowing it can't be avoided. They meet outside the gates. No tricks, no gods, no delector. Runs at first, circles the walls 3 times, like some desperate sacred ritual, but finally stops. They fight it. Not close. Achilles kills Hector in a rage that scorches the sky, then does something no hero should do. He ties Hector's body to his chariot and drags it around the city walls again and again and again. The gods themselves look away. You stand near the walls of Troy that night, and you hear not mourning but silenced Andromache weeping softly in the shadows. The people of Troy watching from towers that suddenly feel to Talland. Achilles down in the dust armor, glowing like a furnace, eyes hollow with grief of an heroes, Brayhaven. Myths bleed. You're still standing on the quiet edge of the battlefield, dust clinging to your skin, smoke curling from the remains of abandoned cookfires. Achilles is nowhere to be seen, but the ground feels like it remembers him. Troy is hushed not because it's beaten, but because it's afraid. Hector was their best, their brightest, the golden thread, holding everything together, and now he's gone, dragged in the dirt by the man whose friend he killed in battle. A friend who wore borrowed armor, a friend who wasn't even supposed to be there in the Greek camp. Things are somehow even worse. Achilles is alive but hollow, walking ghost-like through tents, and refusing to eat, sleep, or let anyone near the body of Patroclus, which he cradles at night like a broken promise. You try to speak to him once, but he doesn't answer, just stares past you into the waves, muttering something about how no glory is worth this, not really. Meanwhile, the gods are having their own crisis. Olympus is restless. Even Zeus, the thunder king, who usually watches this whole mess with popcorn and distant amusement, has had enough. He sends a message to Thetis, and through her, to Achilles' return, the body let Hector go. Achilles resists at first, but eventually something softens. Maybe it's guilt, maybe it's exhaustion, maybe even he has limits to how much rage he can carry in one mortal frame. And then a quiet figure appears in the camp, an old man stooped in grief. Priam, king of Troy, Hector's father, wrapped in travel dust and prayers. He brings gifts, ransoms, kneels before the killer of his son. You watch as Achilles just stares at him. Both men ruined by the same war, victims of the same cycle of pride, loss, and impossible expectations. For the first time, Achilles weeps openly, not just for Patroclus or Hector, but for everyone who's ever walked into battle thinking it would fix something. That night they share food, not much, just enough to remind you that even in the middle of a war, 2 broken people can sit across from each other and remember their human. Priam takes the body back to Troy, and the city mourns, not with noise, but with ritual coins on the eyes, songs sung in courtyards, and the kind of long silent embraces that say everything words can't. You drift through the city and see faces worn by grief, but also resilience. There's still something burning in Troy, not hope, exactly, more like the stubborn refusal to fall. The war doesn't end though, that would be too tidy. It just stretches like a badly written play that refuses to find its third act. The Greeks are tired, their sandals cracked, their food supplies reduced to barley mash and questionable cheese. The Trojans are starving you. Sneak past gates at night and see children chasing shadows for fun. See the nobles trading pearls for dried figs. See Helen, yes Helen, wandering the palace halls, alone her face. Unreadable, depending on who tells the story. She's either remorseful or detached, either victim or architect. Historians still argue whether she was a pawn of the gods, or the sharpest player on the board. You're not sure, but you do see her looking out across the water every morning, as if searching for something she lost before any of this began back. In the Greek camp, Odysseus starts talking, again always scheming. Always one step ahead of everyone else, and now he has a plan. Not another siege, not a final battle, a trick. He whispers it to a few others at first. Diomedes, Menelaus, Epius, the carpenter whose hands are more used to shaping beams than holding swords. Horse, he says, gift gigantic, hollow, and suspiciously well carved, and so it begins with is gathered planks, nailed limbs assembled with divine precision, until it stands tall on the beach, like a monument to misplaced trust. Inside, it will hide a small team. You are not invited, you volunteer anyway, denied. Again further rest of the Greek army pretends to give up, sails away, hides behind an island, just out of sight. The Trojans wake to silence, no war. Chris, no clang of shields, just the breeze, and a big wooden animal parked right outside their front door, like some incredibly sarcastic apology. Bokathe. Debate, of course, they debate. Laocoon, a priest, says, "Don't trust it," famously throws a spear at it, and then gets eaten by sea serpents, which really doesn't help his case. Cassandra says don't trust it either, but she's cursed to never be believed in, so they bring it in to get through the gates, singing, dancing, toasting victory, as the sun sets in ribbons of bronze and wind. At night you perch on the wall, watching as the city sleeps, wrapped in false peace, and just before dawn the hatch opens. You're in the horse, now cramped between a spear tip and someone's knee, and trying very hard not to sneeze. The wooden walls creak faintly around you as the great structure is wheeled deeper into the heart of Troy, pulled by ropes and cheerfully oblivious Trojans who are still humming victory songs and shouting about divine blessings. It's hot in here. Odysseus, beside you, is completely still, breathing through his nose, eyes closed, as if willing his heartbeat to slow. Epius, the carpenter, is sweating silently, holding the release rope, like it's the most important loaf of bread in the world. No one speaks, because they can't, because every sound could ruin it outside. The sun is setting, and you can just barely hear the gates of Troy swinging shut, the iron groan echoing through the horse's belly like a sigh of finality. The city is yours, now, if the timing is right, if no one panics, if the gods don't get bored and decide to interfere. Again, you're not optimistic. The Trojans spend the evening dancing in the streets, the city glowing with torchlight and laughter, amphoras clinking, lyres strumming, couples leaning into each other, as if this nightmare is finally ending. You're stuck in here listening to it all, feeling strangely like an uninvited guest hiding in the attic of a wedding reception. But at last the city sleeps, not all at once, but slowly, layer by layer, until the torches flicker out and the music dies and the footsteps fade and silence blooms. Odysseus moves first, barely a whisper. He reaches for the rope and tugs. The hatch opens with a sound you will never forget, a hollow scrape like fate clearing its throat. One by one the warriors slip out, lowering themselves into the shadowy courtyard, knees stiff, swords drawn, barely daring to breathe. Follow, the air is heavy with jasmine and smoke, the streets lit only by the moon and your footsteps. They split up immediately, racing to the gates to signal the fleet waiting just offshore, torches raised in tiny amber arcs. You head toward the palace. You don't know why, maybe it's curiosity, Maybe it's Helen the Greeks. Pour into the city now, gates thrown open like a curse-released wave after wave of soldiers, filling the sleeping streets. You hate this part, the part where it works, where the plan actually succeeds, because the cost is immediate. Trojans stumble from doorways, only to be struck down in confusion. Mothers pull children into corners, temples burn scrolls, vanish, smoke clings to everything. You're not sure what victory smells like, but this isn't it. To reach the palace, and there she is, Helen, alone in a darkened hall, lit by the last glow of a dying oil lamp, standing perfectly still in a dress that looks far too elegant for this hour. She sees you on for a second, year, not sure if she's going to scream or nod. She does neither. She just turns and walks away, and you suddenly realize she's been expecting this night for years, maybe since the beginning. Back in the square, King Priam is gone, Hector is gone, Paris is gone, Troy is not falling, it has already fallen. The Greeks take what they came for, and then they leave. The journey home is long, strange, and cursed for most, but that is another story. You linger behind just a little longer, watching the city smolder, not because you're proud, but because you need to see it. You need to witness what the apple truly caused. Not just a war, but a wound, one stitched together by story passed down in epic poems, wrapped in glory and guilt. And you realize something, ado. Don't blame the gods, you don't even blame Paris, you blame the silence, the long silences between decisions, between choices, where pride slips in, where apologies should have lived, where things could have been different, but never were. You're walking now along the shoreline again, the war behind you, the air thick with salt and smoke and memory. The city is burning in the distance, but the ships are already pushing off, heavy with loot and silence and warriors who look older than they did 10 years ago, even the ones who never age. No one is celebrating, no one is celebrating. No songs, no cheers, just the low thrum of oars and the occasional clink of something stolen rolling in a hulu. Find a place on one of the ships and sit quietly watching as Troy shrinks behind you like a flame retreating into a matchbox. You want to sleep, but your mind keeps spinning around the same image. A golden apple tossed, so casually, starting something that no one could stop. Odysseus is nearby, leaning on a post, not saying much, probably already plotting something new. Achilles is gone, buried or burned, depending on which version you believe. Killed by Paris with an arrow to the heel, maybe helped by Apollo, maybe just bad luck. Either way, he's not on this ship. You're not entirely sure he's anywhere now, but his name will be etched into songs, shouted in dusty arenas, scribbled into scrolls centuries from now by sleepy poets. And you're just a witness. You pass an island at night and hear voices singing to sweet, too eerie like sirens, but you're too tired to care. Most of the fleet sticks together for a while, then the storms begin. The gods haven't finished playing with the survivors. Some ships vanish, swallowed by waves or cliffs or curses. Others turn on each other, men snapping from hunger, madness, or unresolved arguments about which god deserved the last goat sacrifice. You help row when needed, eat dried figs when offered, wrap yourself in a rough cloak, and dream of home even if you don't quite remember what it looked like anymore. You spend a week stranded on a nameless island with Odysseus and a few others after a particularly nasty storm. Leaves your ship looking like someone sat on it. There's no food except olives, so many olives you never want to see one again. Eventually you're rescued by another passing crew, led by Menelaus, who is somehow still alive, looking tired, confused, and still sort of married. Helen is with him. She doesn't speak much, spends most of her time staring into the sea, as if it's going to answer a question she hasn't asked out loud yet. No one mentions Troy, no one mentions Paris. They just sit quietly and pretend this is all very normal. At one point, someone asks Helen what it was like being the face that launched 1,000 ships. She doesn't answer, just lifts a goblet to her lips and says in the softest voice you've ever heard, they could have just sent a letter. You're not sure if she's joking. Neither is anyone else. You dock in Crete for supplies and gossip there. You hear wild stories that Agamemnon made it home only to be murdered in his bathtub by his wife, that Odysseus still hasn't made it back and may be stuck with a goddess who keeps making him dinner and weird eye contact, that Cassandra tried to warn everyone about everything and no one ever listened, not even at the end. Historians still argue whether half of these stories were true or just things people whispered to make sense of the wreckage. But you walk through the markets hearing them retold again and again in different voices with new embellishments, and you start to realize something: the war isn't over. It's just changing shape, from battlefields to legends, from scars to epics, from noise to lullabies. Eventually you find your own way. Home, a quiet village, maybe a coastal port, maybe a hilltop with goats that do not talk. You lie on your back one night, staring up at stars that haven't moved an inch, and for the first time in years you sleep through the night. You're in Ithaca now, or near it, depending on the current location of the boat and the mood of the waves. Odysseus still isn't home, but you are following close behind him as the island hops through some of the weirdest travel delays known to myth. Was supposed to be a quick return sail, a short journey, maybe a few celebratory goat roasts and a well-deserved nap. Instead, it's been years of detours, detainments, and divine obstacles, tossed in by gods who apparently got bored once the war ended. You see him on a deck again, staring ahead, jaw clenched as if trying to outstare Poseidon himself, which is bold considering Poseidon is still very upset about that whole blinding his son thing. Yes, the Cyclops, that delightful little episode where Odysseus and his men wandered into a cave, found some cheese, and accidentally provoked a gigantic one-eyed shepherd who started eating them. They escaped, of course, but not before Odysseus gave his name away in a moment of pure ego. Still argue whether shouting his identity after a clean getaway was heroic or just extremely on brand. With them when they land on Ia, the island of Circe, the sorceress who turns half the crew into pigs because apparently they just walked into her house and started eating everything. You remember sitting by the hearth watching pigmen wander in circles and thinking this is not how normal vacations go. Odysseus manages to charm her. Eventually they stay a full year of wine, comfort, and enchanted distractions, until finally someone gently reminds him he has a wife and child waiting. You sail on again, and this time it's worse because now you know home exists, but you still can't reach it. You pass the sirens, their song curling over the waves like warm honey laced with sleep. Odysseus ties himself to the mast, ears wide open, determined to hear the song without being pulled under. You plug your ears with wax like the others, still hearing the music faintly through your teeth. It doesn't promise riches or love, just understanding. You're not sure which is more dangerous than Scylla and Charybdis to maritime nightmares waiting on either side of a narrow strait. You huddle in the ship's belly as 6 men vanish above you, with barely a scream pulled from the deck by something too fast to describe. Later, you catch Odysseus alone, watching the waves, chewing dried figs, slowly, and saying nothing. You don't ask. Eventually you reach Thrinacia, the island of Helios and his sacred cattle. Odysseus warns everyone, do not eat the cows. No matter how hungry, do not eat the cows. Guess what they do? The storm that follows is not metaphorically lit, massive, brutal, relentless. Only Odysseus survives, clinging to driftwood like a very soggy poem in progress. You float beside him in silence, the sea warm and uncarindua, Not sure if you're alive or just part of the story. Now he washes up on Ogygiada, island of Calypso, where time moves like syrup and reality bends around loneliness. Offers him immortality bed, a kingdom, no more storms. But he says no, not immediately, not loudly, but eventually, because he still remembers Ithaca even. After all this time, Io are there, when Hermes arrives, all gold sandals and businesslike tone tells Calypso to let the mortal go. She does almost gently. Odysseus builds a raft with hands that have forgotten what certainty feels like. Hand sails against this in time to be shipwrecked again, and Phaeacia, where he tells his story in one long, exhausted breath over wine. And fish, the people there listen with wide eyes and half smiles. They love him, feed him, for him passage home. Finally, Finalua, standing on Ithacan soil. It's smaller than you remembered, quieter, but it's home. You're in Ithaca, and it's not how you imagined it theirs. No parade, no garlands, no fanfare. Just a tired man stepping onto a rocky shore with sea salt in his beard and 20 years behind his eyes. Odysseus doesn't announce himself right away. Instead, he hides, watches. This is a man who's survived monsters, gods, storms, betrayal, and boredom, and he hesitates now, not out of fear, but out of caution, because time has moved on and he doesn't know what he'll find with him as he wanders through olive groves that still remember his childhood touch, stone paths where his footsteps echo softer than they used to. He visits Eumaeus, the loyal swineherd, who doesn't recognize him, but offers kindness anyway. A meal, a seat, a story. You sit near the fire, listening to tales about the absent king, tales you both know aren't quite accurate, but close enough. Telemachus arrives, not long after Odysseus reveals himself, not with grand speeches, but with quiet proof, an old scar, a shared glance, a story only a father would know. The reunion isn't loud, it's layered, silent tears, muffled laughter, a long embrace that says more than 10 years of words ever could. But there's no time to rest, because inside the palace are the suitors, dozens of them, men who have feasted in his halls, drunk his wine, laughed in his chairs, and tried to claim his wife. Penelope has held them off with wit and weaving, unraveling her work each night so that the wedding never comes. Historians still argue whether Penelope truly believed Odysseus would return, or simply chose the least awful path in a world of limited choice. You're not sure, but when you see her standing in the hallway, spine straight, eyes clear, hands still stained faintly with wool, you believe in her. Odysseus enters the palace in disguise, dressed as a beggar face, shadowed by dust and patient snow. One knows him except Argos, his old dog, who sees him wags once, and Daizu feels something tighten in your chest as you look away, pretending the smoke in the hearth is stinging your eyes. The contest comes soon after. Penelope announces she'll marry the man who can string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads lined in a row. Jower. There you see the suitors try and fail one by one. The bow bends but never breaks, until finally the beggar steps forward. Laughter follows, but then silences. He strings the bowers. The arrow flies and lands true. You're not surprised when the doors lock, when the arrows fly, when the room becomes a reckoning. It's fast brutally. Not sure who you're more afraid of, the suitors or the man who no longer hesitates when it's over. Odysseus stands alone in a hall full of silence and spilled wine. Penelope waits at the top of the stairs. She doesn't run to him. She tests him about the bed he built from a living olive tree, and when he answers exactly right, she lets go. Finale. Two of them sit beneath the stars that night, saying nothing, wrapped in a silence deeper than sleep. You're just outside, listening to the wind through Olive leaves thinking about how long it took to get here, not just the miles, but the years, the losses, the godsend, the quiet strength it took to keep believing in something as fragile as home. You're somewhere between a campfire and a broken wall, the smoke curling gently, as if even it is tired of rising. The war is long over, the poems mostly written, the cities rebuilt or forgotten, but there's one image you can't shake, the horse, not just the wooden kind, but the idea of it, the perfect trick, the gift nobody questioned, the container of everything that followed you. Not the only one. Bards sing it in taverns, now with varying details, depending on how much wine is left in the jug. Some say it was Odysseus's idea, some say it was Athena's, some say it never happened at all, and that Troy fell to bribes, betrayal, or disease. Historians still argue whether the Trojan horse was literal, metaphorical, or just a very good lie told so often it became truth. You're sitting with a traveling poet now, someone who heard about your long journey and asked for stories in exchange for bread. You tell him what you remember, he writes it down, but differently, cleaner, more heroic, fewer olives. You don't correct him, because now you're starting to understand these stories aren't his story. There come for their warnings, there lullabies with swords. You walk through a village market later and hear a child playing with carved figures, calling one of them Achilles and another Hector. He makes them band, then hug on. You smile because that version is kin to you. Pass a group of travelers, trading tales of gods, disguised as animals, lovers turned into trees, and kings who vanished into the sea hour. Not sure which are real anymore, but you know they matter, because people need stories more than they need truth, sometimes, especially at night, especially when the world feels too loud. You find a quiet place by the river and trace shapes in the mud with a stick, remembering the faces of those who didn't return. Patroclus, Hector, Achilles, Paris, Helen, maybe still alive, maybe not. You wonder what she would say if she could rewrite her part. Maybe she'd ask for a quieter entrance, maybe she'd throw the apple back. You lie back and stare up at the stars, the same stars that hung over Troy, that watched the ships set sail, that blinked when gods argued over dinner. They don't care who want thee, are still here, still shining. You close your eyes, let the sounds of the river wash through your ears, let the stories settle in your bones be. 'Cause even if the details change, the feeling doesn't tone. Apple, one argument, one long ripple through time, and here you are, still listening, still drifting, still dreaming of cities made of marble and myths. You're on the deck of another ship now, one that feels slower, softer, more like a drifting thought than a vessel. This is Odysseus's journey again, but it's different. Now, not the main tale, not the proud speech-worthy parts, but the detours, the side quests, the in-between places that no one ever really talks about. You restopping again and again, islands, coves, winds pulling the ship like threads, tangled by gods with too much time and not enough hobbies, and each stop is stranger with him. When he lands on the island of the Lotus Eaters, a place where no one remembers why they came or why they should leave, where the air is sweet and everything tastes like forgetting, he almost stays you, almost stays you, almost stays you, almost homes. Who back then there's the island of the Laestrygonianshu. Don't talk about that one too. Many splinters, too many screams, too many ships lost in a single afternoon, like teeth pulled from the sea. You press forward anyway, because it's Odysseus, and because what else is there to do but follow? Next comes Aeolus, the wind goader, strange figure who gives a bag of winds, tied shut and full of promises. It works until the crew opens it, thinking maybe it's treasure, maybe it's too easy, maybe they just don't trust that anything can be that simple. The wind explodes in every direction and, just like that, you're back where you started. Odysseus says nothing, just sits there quietly for a long time, staring at the horizon like it betrayed him personally, and so it continues. After trap delay, after delay, Circe again, and again, each place full of magic food visions. Sleep, danger, all blurred together in a haze of immortality and exhaustion. You feel time start to slide, not forward or backward, but sideways, like a wave that forgets where it's going. You meet Tiresias in the underworld, a blind prophet whose words echo louder than the dead around him. He tells Odysseus what he already fears, that he will make it home, but it will cost him, that the gods are not done yet, that peace is never clean. You walk among the dead for what feels like hours, hearing old voices call out names you thought forgotten. Achilles is there, but quiet, still shining, even in shadow. He doesn't boast anymore, just nods as you pass, like someone who knows exactly how the story ends and wishes it had gone a little differently. You leave the underworld lighter, but not freer. Sea opens again ahead of you, but now everything feels like a test. Another storm, another island, another moment where Odysseus almost breaks. And you wonder if maybe he already has. You see him one night, sitting alone, writing his name in the sand with a piece of driftwood, then watching it wash away. Doesn't rewrite, it just gets up and walks on. You're tired, now not just in the body, but in the heart, like someone who's lived too many versions of the same tale, but still you sail, 'cause you're close now. The stars seem familiar. The air smells like olive trees and dust and unfinished conversation. Sure, almost home, and this time, you hope, it sticks. You're back on Ithacan soil again, but this time, it's different. Odysseus is no longer hiding, no longer creeping through shadows or testing old loyalties. He's home fully, completely, and there's nothing left to conquer but time itself. You follow him through the familiar halls of his palace, where the walls remember his footsteps and the floors remember his silence. Penelope is by his side, sometimes quiet, sometimes smiling, sometimes lost in thoughts you can't follow. Telemachus walks the grounds like a young man who's seen too much too early, carrying the weight of a name he's only recently learned to wear. Not sure what you expected. Trumpets, maybe feasts, maybe peace, maybe peace. Life after a myth is complicated. Odysseus tries to settle, to be a husband, a father, a king again, but he's restless, not in his hands or his eyes, but somewhere deeper, something that stirs when the waves crash too loudly at night, or when the olive trees shift in the wind just enough to sound like sails. You see him sit by the fire, polishing armor that he no longer wears, tracing old scars, not with pride but with wonder, like he's surprised. There's still, Ithaca is quiet, but it's not still. There are arguments in the court, grumbles from nobles, old debts come to collect, new threats rising from distant lands. Peace is never clean. You watch as Odysseus handles them with a kind of tired wisdom, not sharp, not angry, just steady, like a man who no longer needs to prove anything. He spends mornings walking the terraces, watching birds circle the sea, watching Penelope tend to the loom, not unweaving anymore, just weaving. You're with him one day when a stranger arrives, claiming to be someone who fought beside him in Troy. Odysseus listens to the story with polite nods, but you can tell he knows it's false. Later, he tells you he doesn't correct them anymore. If they need to believe they were there, let them. The story is theirs now. Tujawa. Not sure if that's kindness or surrender, but it sounds like peace. There's a strange joy in the small things now. Goat cheese and figs in the morning, cool jugs of water pressed to sunburned skin, children arguing about who gets to be Achilles in their game. You watch Telemachus help repair a fishing boat, his arms strong, his voice steady, and you think maybe this next story will be simpler. But the gods are always listening, and one night they speak again. A Final task, a final journey, a final bit of unfinished fate whispered on the wind from a prophet's dream. Odysseus must leave again, not for war, not for glory, but to plant an oar in a land that does not know the sea. Or not sure what that means. He's not sure either, but he packs a bag anyway, not with weapons, with stories. You walk with him to the edge of the island, where the sand meets the path and the sky begins to stretch. He turns once, says nothing, just nods and walks away. You're left with the trees, the wind, the soft hush of waves that remember everything. You're standing now in the middle of a different kind of story, one that begins not with gods or ships or golden apples, but with bloodlines and grudges and the strange inheritance of memory, because the war may be over and the heroes buried or crowned, but their children are still here and they have questions. You find yourself in the halls of Mycenae again, where Orestes walks under the weight of a father's death and a mother's revenge and a prophecy that says justice sometimes looks like vengeance. Wearing a very old robe, Agamemnon is gone, killed by Clytemnestra, his wife, who waited through 10 years of war only to greet him with a knife in the bath. Historians still debate whether she did it for revenge or power, or simply because she'd had enough of men sailing off to glory and returning with Corsesia, with Orestes, as he stands in that same hall, breathing the same air, with the same blade in his hand. He does eithe. Kill's hand, the furies come, not metaphorical ones, real, ancient shadowed figures who chase him through dreams and temples and lonely roads, whispering guilt into every footstep. You're there when Apollo tells him it was just Ise, or you're there when Athena tells him it was complicated. You're there when the trial ends, not with a verdict, but with a new law that maybe sometimes revenge has to end before the world can move on. You leave Mycenae with your thoughts heavy, but there's no rest yet, because in Thebes another curse waits. Antigone, daughter of Oedipus's granddaughter of prophecy, walks through a city that's buried more kings than its crown. She defies an order, she buries her brother, and for that she's condemned. You see her walk to her tomb, calm, proud, sad, in the way of people who have learned that being right doesn't always save you. Another name added to the list, another voice echoing through time. You follow the threads, now tracing them through generations, through Aeneas, son of Aphrodite, who fled the burning of Troy with his father on his back and his son by his side. He sails not for home, but for a new one, Italy, Rome, city not yet born from a myth, not yet finished. You're with him through storms and monsters, and one woman named Dido, who loved too hard and died too fast. You hear the whispers that his descendants will found empires, that one day the ashes of Troy will bloom into marble again. The irony is not lost on youth. The fall of one city births another, that destruction folds into legacy like cloth worn too many times to unravel. You pause in a quiet grove where no stories are being told, where the birds chirp without metaphor, where the sky is just blue, not omen, not symbol, just sky. And you wonder how many more generations will carry this tale, how long before the names are forgotten and the songs remain, because that's the strange thing about myths. They re-stick even when the people fade, even when the places are rubbled. The stories cling like sand in your sandals, like olive oil in your hair, like a golden apple rolling quietly into someone else's feast. You're sitting in a shaded portico now, somewhere between a university and a daydream, where the walls are lined with scrolls and the floors echo with sandals and questions. Historians are talking again, not warriors or poets this time, but people with ink on their fingers and arguments in their throats. There, debating the apple nut, whether it was shiny or gold. That much everyone agrees on. Betoir, Whether it was ever real, some say, the apple was always just an allegory, a glittering excuse to explain. A war that had more to do with economics than egos, that the siege of Troy was about trade routes and power, not beauty and bruised pride. Others say no, they point to fragments, to pottery shards, to burned walls that might be the bones of Troy, or at least something close enough to be convincing if you squint. There's even debate about Eris. Was she truly the goddess of discord, or a literary invention to make everything easier to blame? You're not here to argue war, just listening. One scroll describes the apple as an invention by later poets meant to tie chaos into a neat narrative bow. Another scroll says there were dozens of versions of this myth in circulation, and they only started agreeing on the story once someone decided to write it all down in hexameter, leaning against a pillar, chewing on a date, and wondering how it is that the same story can live so many different lives. Student nearby asks a professor if Helen really existed. The professor smiles and says, maybe, but even if she didn't, her shadow certainly did. You are taken through different versions of the myth, now alternate tellings, buried in papyri or murmured in corners of dusty libraries. One version, the apple isn't gold at all, but made of amber, soft and warm and forgotten in a box for centuries. In another version, Paris chooses Athena, not Aphrodite, and becomes a philosopher instead of a prince. In one telling, Helen never leaves Sparta, and the whole war is fought over a phantom, a trick of the gods to make mortals play their games. You wonder if that version would have been kinder or just stranger. There's even a theory that the apple was meant to be a joke, a divine prank gone wrong, a bit of mischief that spiraled beyond anyone's control. You're inclined to believe that one because it feels true, not in the scholarly sense, but in the way myths often do, where the facts are less important than the feeling, where the lesson isn't about the apple at Albert, about what happens when people stop listening and start choosing sides. Stroll out of the hall into the courtyard, where the sun dapples through olive branches and the wind smells faintly of parchment and citrus. You sit on a bench and think back to the party that started it, all to the goddesses, waiting for their answer to Paris, standing in the middle of history, holding a fruit and a decision. You wonder if he hesitated, if he knew, if anyone ever really knows. The scholars keep arguing behind you. One says it's all metaphor, and another says there was a real apple somewhere, a real wedding, a real fight. You don't need to decide, because the point isn't whether the apple was real. The point is that it worked, it rolled, it glittered, and everyone followed. You're back where it all began now, not in time, but in feeling, a space where memory and myth blur into something soft and slow. War is over, the ships have gone, the gods are mostly quiet, and the scrolls have already started to yellow at the edge. Walking through a grove at dusk, olive trees rising like old guardians around you, the ground beneath your feet springy with years of fallen leaves and forgotten sandals. You trace the steps backward, not literally, but with your mind. The wedding done. Applever, goddesses, Paris, Helen, Troya, killers all of it too. Try to figure out where the first wrong turn was. Was it the apple? Was it Eris not getting an invite? Was it Paris saying yes to beauty instead of wisdom or power? Was it long before that? Maybe it started when gods started acting like people, or when people started thinking they could be gods. Yeah, not here to blame anyone. You're just following the threads, because if you pull gently enough, they don't snap, they braid. The more you walk, the more you notice how many versions of this story have passed through your ears. Some told with fire, others with whispers, some sharp and tragic, others Soft and strange you sit beneath a tree and pick up a small fruit fallen nearby, round and golden in the light. It's not magic, it's not cursed, it's just an apple butt. You turn it in your hands anyway and think about how something so simple could carry so much weight if the right people are looking. You think about Helen, not the caricature, not the legend, but the woman who lived in the middle of all of it too. Wonder what she would say if she could walk beside you. Now maybe she'd laugh, maybe she'd laugh, maybe she'd roll her eyes, maybe she'd say she never asked to be anyone's prize. You think about Paris, whether he really believed in love or just didn't know how to say no. You think about Achilles and how even gods couldn't stop him from breaking. You think about Odysseus, still sailing in some versions of the tale, still wandering, because maybe some people are made to journey, not to arrive. And as you sit there, you realize something small and warm and true. None of them were ever meant to be perfect. Not the heroes, not the villains, not the gods. They were just stories made by people who needed meaning. You lie back in the grass, look at the sky, watch the stars begin to blink into place, like old names being whispered into the night. And you let the weight of the story fall away, not because it's over, but because it's been told. And sometimes that's enough. Wind down. Section. The breeze is gentler now, brushing through the leaves like a soft hand smoothing a page. The grass beneath you is warm and familiar, and the distant hum of cicadas feels like the world exhaling. There's nothing left to chase, no armies to follow, no riddles to solve, just the quiet after everything. You let your shoulders sink a little deeper, let your breath stretch longer. The stars are steady, the trees sway without needing to go anywhere. Apple has stopped rolling and the story, well, the story is asleep now. So are the ships, so are the gods, and soon so are you. Close your icy hour, already home.